Hey, what's up, guys? Happy Monday. Welcome back from spring break. We are going to get into Unit 15 today, kind of outline for the week. So we're starting Unit 15, which is our civil rights movement. It'll go for about week and a half. By next Wednesday, we will have our writing assessment. This week, we will have lectures Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Friday. On Thursday, you guys are doing a quick write on the discussion board. And then on Wednesday and Friday, you have your vocab quizzes. So make sure you are checking in the files in Canvas to get all your Unit 15 stuff. There are 2 sets of vocab. Each one has 11 terms in it. And then you will take a quiz Wednesday over Part 1, Friday over Part 2. Okay? This first video lecture I'm going to do over the civil rights movement, which is chapters 44, 45, and 46, is really kind of going over the stuff we finished up with before spring break in the 1950s that carry over in the civil rights movement. So this one might be a little bit shorter than the other ones because there's probably not as much explaining that I have to do because you guys should already know this, but we're going to jump right into it, okay? If you noticed, going with my quarantine beard, all right? I know we were all expecting to be back in the classroom today, but we'll make do, okay? Hopefully we see each other after May 1st. So, segregation and public accommodation. First, we're going to start out with, there's a couple really important Supreme Court cases that we're going to talk about during the civil rights movement. The very first one is Plessy versus Ferguson. This started segregation, all right? This is all the way back during Reconstruction. This is the separate but equal ruling, okay? That's simple. All you need to do to remember Plessy versus Ferguson are those 4 words, separate but equal ruling, all right? It's creating separate facilities for everything. Places that segregation occurred, movie theaters, restaurants, libraries, parks, transportation services, restrooms, schools, you name it, it was separated, okay? And we've already talked about this, so you guys probably have a pretty good understanding of where segregation occurred, where it was happening, and what entities were actually being segregated. Next are Jim Crow laws. Again, this goes all the way back to Reconstruction. We've talked about these. Jim Crow laws established separate facilities for whites and African Americans throughout the South. And this was a law. So if you were caught using a white facility and you were a minority, an African American, or someone of a different race, you could be arrested for that. So it was a punishable offense by law. Often there was simply no accommodation for African Americans. A lot of restaurants would refuse service completely to minority groups. You know, how many of you guys have seen Remember the Titans? This is probably one movie that I can bring up that all of you guys have seen, or at least 90% of you have seen. There's a scene in Remember the Titans when, I think it's after the first football game that they win, they're walking through Main Street and they're having a good time. And the team is integrated because the school's integrated. So they're used to, having African Americans and whites together. They don't see a problem with this. Well, the one white athlete wants to take them into a restaurant to eat. The African American players are hesitant with this. They go in, and when they go in, everyone kind of turns and looks at them. They ask for a table, and the owner comes out and refuses service to the African Americans. They say they can go eat in the back with the cooks. And so this kind of shows you the mentality that was around during this time period, especially in the South and that middle part of the United States, okay? So moving on, segregation in schools. Segregation in schools began to appear shortly after the Civil War during Reconstruction. In 1888, school segregation had been established in almost every southern state. It was also very prevalent in the North and in the West. In the West, we talk about segregation not so much with African Americans. We will, but also with Western immigrants to Chinese. All right. In the North, you have cities like Louisville, Cincinnati, even Pittsburgh, and places like that were very segregated. Even though they fought for the North in the Civil War, and you think there's a lot of equality, there really wasn't. There was this deep-held connection to the South in a lot of these areas. And so this created resentment. Obviously, the Great Migration is something else that's going to cause a lot of problems and a lot of segregation, and that's going to happen right before the World War I. Teachers in African American schools got lower salaries and had to teach in harsher conditions because you have to realize that the school buildings, the places that they're working, aren't up to par, aren't up to standard with the white schools. All right, these schools are falling apart. They're dilapidated. There's no heating. There's no cooling in these schools. They have leaky roofs. They have terrible resources and books and things like that that are completely outdated. And there's a reason for that, because members of white society that were making these rules and making these laws didn't want African Americans to have the same chance or same opportunity as white students. So they were really holding them back by creating more obstacles in their education, just hoping that more students would end up dropping out. Later, we're going to talk about the Little Rock Nine, which is a group of students in Arkansas who break the color barrier in that state, and some of the challenges that they face. Students had to gather firewood to heat their classrooms a lot of times, and especially in a lot of the poor southern areas. You got to think a lot of these first schools were those freedmen schools. If you think all the way back to Reconstruction, I showed you a picture of a log cabin, and it had all these African American students. And then you had a white teacher, and it was a freedman school. These are very rustic, remote schools that lacked any sanitation, electricity, or anything like that. And children are just trying to learn the basic skills, reading, writing, basic math. All right, nothing that's going to advance them to like a college. All right. Segregation in other areas. This one I'll go over quick because it's kind of, it covers about 4 points that we talked about last time that were in your vocab last time as well. Housing. There's 2 forms of segregation in housing. Remember, we talked about restrictive covenant before, where people wouldn't sell their homes to people that were minorities. They had this agreement that was found to be unconstitutional. People said that you couldn't do that. Well, the 2 forms that we're seeing are by practice and customs, all right? And the other is by law. So de facto and de jure segregation, right? Those same things, those 2 terms that we talked about last unit are coming back up in this unit because in the South, de facto and de jure segregation occurred all over, okay? You're going to see it in places like Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, Georgia, Tennessee, all right, South Carolina, North Carolina. So it's going to be practiced and it's going to be heavily seen. And it's going to be carried out through law. White residents used informal measures to keep African Americans out of their neighborhoods, like we talked about. Marriage, miscegenation that we talked about before. Interracial marriage was not allowed in a lot of these southern states. And so this is another obstacle that the civil rights movement is going to try and tackle. In the workplace, few African Americans held white-collar jobs. We know this because the lack of education that most were getting at this time. A lot of African Americans weren't going to college, and most of the time a college degree equates to a white-collar job. Many African Americans were employed as skilled laborers. Well, look at their background. What are they used to working in? What did they do before? Well, they worked in the fields. So agriculture is a huge area that African Americans continue to work in during the civil rights. And we're seeing that transition into the factory system with industrialization, with the Great Migration, because you can be a skilled or unskilled labor worker and work in the manufacturing industry. But both these, agriculture and manufacturing, are both blue-collar jobs, okay? The median income of African American men was less than half of white men. So you can see the discrepancy in pay. We talked about last unit about discrepancy in pay when it comes to women. You're seeing the same thing with minorities, whether it's African Americans, Hispanic, Chinese. Pay is going to be a lot less, and that's another thing that the civil rights leaders are going to fight for, equalities when it comes to income. All of this, guys, is a result of racism. At the root of all segregation and everything that's happening during this time period is racism, especially in the South. And you can probably guess what group is really behind this, the Ku Klux Klan. Remember, we talked about the Ku Klux Klan and the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, especially in the 1920s, and they're starting to gain strength. So as we move forward in the 1950s and 60s, the Ku Klux Klan is extremely strong, very influential in the South, in using their racist rhetoric to push their ideals on the community as scare tactics. Real quick, the next slide, you kind of see this image. It shows places that were enacted with interracial marriage laws from 1849 to 1943. The areas in the red are areas that had interracial law marriages. So what you see is places like Indiana, places like California, Idaho, Montana, North and South Dakota. But again, not all these are just towards African Americans. These are geared towards all minority groups. So a lot of places in the West, yeah, African Americans would fit into that, but it could also be for Hispanic, Asian, or Native American descent. You see the enactment of segregation laws from 1865 to 1949 on the next picture slide. And you can see where it's extremely heavy. It's the blue areas. And those are the Confederate States of America. Those are the states that revolted against the United States and tried to secede from the Union and fought for slavery. So it makes sense that they are not only having laws against education for minorities, but also social practice laws, so like segregation and public accommodation and things like that, against African Americans as well. But again, you see it stretching into places like the Midwest and into the North. Indiana is a common state that you see this popping up. And we'll talk about later in the 80s and 90s, Indiana was a state that had a large Ku Klux Klan influence in it. It went as deep as to their mayor of Indianapolis. So that's something that is surprising just based on geography of where the state is. But once you start learning more about the state, it's maybe not as shocking. So segregation and politics. This will be the last one of part 1 of our video slide for day 1. We'll do part 2. I'll finish up with 4 more slides for you guys here for Monday as well. So segregation and politics, some of the things they did. They denied voting rights, poll taxes, and literacy tests. We talked about these, especially at the beginning, during Reconstruction, when you had a lot of uneducated, a lot of struggling African Americans. These are 2 ways to disenfranchise them, to keep them from voting, all right? The white primaries that were put in place. These were put in place by the Democratic Party in the South, those Southern Democrats that we talked about. In 1944, the Supreme Court said these primaries were unconstitutional because if you only allow whites to choose who the representative for the general public to vote on, well, they're going to pick someone that believes in what they believe in, and it's probably white. So you're not going to have any African American or other minority representatives when it comes to voting. Gerrymandering is another one. Gerrymandering is the redrawing of voting district lines. This gives one party or group of voters an advantage over the other. Black voters were often denied political influence during gerrymandering. So if you have 4 quadrants and you have a really big African American population, say, in the middle of that quadrant, okay? What you're going to do when you gerrymander is break it up so the African American votes get split. And so all 4 quadrants then will be ran by white elected officials because by splitting the votes of African Americans, they don't have a majority to outvote the whites in those areas. So, they only have 1/4 of that block and 3/4 of the block is white. That means you're going to have 4 elected white officials. If they broke it up into 5 quadrants, then you'd have 1 quadrant that would have representatives in the middle for African Americans. But obviously the white legislators, the white people in state Congress, didn't want that to happen. They wanted to make sure that only whites had influence and say in the government and in politics. All right? Okay, that's where we're going to stop for part 1, day 1 of our video lecture. I'll be right back here in about 2 minutes. Got it? All right, take a quick break, and let's get back into it. See you guys.